3 hours before my wedding, I was sitting in the bridal suite in Charleston when my mother's Instagram story appeared on my phone. She was raising a glass of champagne in the lobby of the Harbor Crest Hotel, surrounded by relatives who were supposed to be getting ready for my ceremony. The caption said, "Family sticks together, even when someone chooses to leave us." They were 3 blocks away from the venue. My mother and father still had seats waiting for them, and the hotel rooms they were standing in had already been paid for by me. Before I tell you how my parents went from shredding my wedding invitation to expecting me to finance their luxury weekend, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from today. Stay with me, because what happened at checkout was only the beginning of what finally broke my mother's version of our family apart. And if you enjoy stories about people learning that boundaries have consequences, subscribe to the channel and stay with me until the end. My phone rang before I could close the story. A woman from the front desk explained that someone in our family block had asked to transfer a group of incidental charges from my father's folio onto my wedding account, and because my name was attached to the room authorization, they needed my approval. I looked at myself in the mirror, already wearing my wedding makeup, and felt that familiar pressure behind my ribs that used to make me solve whatever problem my family put in front of me. "No," I said, "room and tax only. No transfers." She confirmed it, thanked me, and ended the call. At the time, I had no idea how expensive those 3 words would become for my father the next morning. To understand why my family was drinking champagne 3 blocks from my wedding, instead of sitting in the seats I had reserved for them, you have to go back 6 weeks. It started at our engagement dinner in Raleigh, on a Thursday night that should have been ordinary. My Uncle Craig had already had several drinks when he started making jokes about Ethan's job as a high school history teacher. Craig had always enjoyed disguising insults as humor, especially when he thought everyone else was too polite to challenge him. "So you get summers off, and Rachel has the serious retirement plan," he said, grinning across the table at Ethan. "Sounds like you figured out how to marry smart." A couple of people gave uncomfortable laughs. Ethan did not. Neither did I. Craig had made versions of that joke before, about Ethan's salary, about my savings, about how convenient it must be for a teacher to marry a woman with a stable administrative career. I had warned him more than once that Ethan's finances were not entertainment for family dinners. That night, I stopped warning him. "You've had enough warnings," I said. "You're not coming to the wedding." The table went quiet. Craig's smile disappeared first, then my mother's. Ethan did not reach for my hand or tell me to calm down, because he knew I did not need rescuing. Craig leaned back and said I was being dramatic, but I told him I was not discussing it. I had spent too many years watching rude behavior become acceptable simply because the rude person was related to us. My mother waited until we were in the parking lot before coming after me. Linda did not ask Craig to apologize, and she did not mention what he had said about Ethan. Instead, she asked whether I was seriously planning to exclude a 61-year-old man from a family wedding because of one stupid joke. I reminded her it had not been one joke. She folded her arms and said, "If my own brother isn't family enough for your wedding, maybe I need to think about whether I belong there either." "That's your decision," I told her. "Craig is still not coming." My father looked exhausted before the argument had even properly started. Mark had spent most of my life treating my mother's anger like bad weather, something the rest of us were expected to dress around. "You know how your mother is," he said quietly. "Just give it a day." I looked at him and realized he was not asking her to reconsider anything. He was asking me to change because I was the person most likely to be reasonable. The next morning, my mother called while I was at work. I stepped into an empty conference room because I knew better than to have family arguments where my coworkers could hear them. Linda told me I needed to fix the situation before relatives started hearing about it, as though Craig's behavior were a public relations problem I had created. I told her once, clearly, that Craig was not invited, and that her invitation had not changed. "So you're really making us choose?" she asked. "No," I said. "I'm deciding who enters my wedding. What you do with that is yours." I ended the call believing clarity would protect me. That was one of my biggest mistakes. I was good at budgets, schedules, contracts, and operations because facts behave themselves when you organize them properly. I had not yet accepted that my mother could take one fact, turn it sideways, and make 5 relatives believe 5 different things without technically inventing a single event. That Friday evening, Ethan and I were home reviewing final vendor emails when our family group chat began exploding. My mother had posted a video from her dining room. She was sitting at the table with my father beside her, holding the invitation Ethan and I had mailed them months earlier. Linda looked into the camera and said she could not attend a wedding that required her to turn her back on her own brother. Then she tore my invitation in half. She tore it again, slowly enough for everyone watching to understand that the gesture was deliberate. My father sat beside her and watched the pieces fall onto the table. "If that's her choice, so be it," he said. Within minutes, relatives were messaging me privately, "Call your mother. Don't let this ruin the wedding. Craig was wrong, but family is family." Not one of them asked why my mother's invitation had been destroyed when I had never withdrawn it. My fingers were already moving toward the group chat when Ethan gently touched my wrist. "You don't have to answer this tonight," he said. I stared at the screen for another few seconds, then turned my phone face down. I was angry, but underneath the anger was something colder. I knew exactly what would happen if I started defending myself line by line. My wedding would become a trial, my mother would become the injured party, and I would spend the next 6 weeks presenting evidence that I was allowed to decide who attended my own ceremony. The next morning, my mother called again. There was still no apology for the video. Instead, she reminded me that Ethan and I had promised to cover the family's rooms at the Harbor Crest Hotel in Charleston. We had reserved 8 rooms for 2 nights for relatives traveling from out of town, and we had set aside roughly $11,000 from wedding savings for room charges and taxes. It was not pocket change for us, but it was money we had planned for over the previous year. "You are still honoring that promise, aren't you?" Linda asked. "Or are you breaking that too?" My father was close enough to the phone that I heard him say, "A commitment is a commitment." For a moment, I considered canceling their rooms. I had every right to do it. They had publicly announced that they were not coming to my wedding, and part of me wanted to tell them that people who tore up invitations did not get luxury accommodations paid by the bride. But canceling the rooms would give my mother exactly what she wanted. Another story in which I had punished my family for refusing to obey me. I looked across the kitchen at Ethan. He did not tell me what to do. He just waited, because this was my family, and he understood that the decision needed to be mine. "You're right," I told my mother. "I did promise." Her tone changed immediately. She sounded almost satisfied, as if something had been restored to its proper order. We ended the call, and Ethan raised an eyebrow at me. I put the phone down and said, "I promised rooms. That's what I'm paying for. Nothing else." 6 weeks later, that distinction was going to matter more than anyone in my family understood. I thought I had simply kept one promise. My father thought I had agreed to keep playing my old role. The morning after my mother reminded me about the hotel rooms, I sat at our kitchen table and wrote the shortest email I could manage. I had already learned that long explanations gave Linda more sentences to pull apart, so I kept it simple. "Your seats remain reserved. If you change your minds, you are welcome to attend. Craig will not be added. I won't debate this further." I sent it to both my parents and closed my laptop. Ethan asked if I wanted to copy anyone else in the family so there would be no confusion later, but I said no. I was not going to turn my wedding into a legal case where every relative needed exhibits. At the time, I still believed that if I said something clearly enough, the truth would remain clear. A few days later, my Aunt Susan called while I was driving home from work. She did not sound angry at first, just uncomfortable, which somehow made the conversation worse. She said my mother had told her I was forcing Linda to choose between her daughter and her brother. I told Susan that nobody had asked my parents to choose anything. Craig was not invited because of his behavior, while my parents still had 2 seats waiting for them. Susan went quiet before saying, "There has to be more to this, Rachel. Your mother wouldn't tear up your invitation over nothing." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and told her that more did not always mean what people wanted it to mean. Craig had been warned repeatedly. He crossed the line again, and I finally enforced the boundary. Susan sighed and said she hoped I would reconsider before the whole family was damaged. By the time I hung up, I understood something I had not expected. My mother's version of events had reached everyone before mine had even left my kitchen. Amanda came next. My younger sister asked if we could meet for coffee, and I agreed because I thought she wanted to talk as my sister, not as another representative from my mother's side. We had barely sat down before she said, "Mom just wants one phone call, Rachel, one apology, then maybe everybody can calm down." I asked her what exactly I was supposed to apologize for. Amanda stirred her coffee without looking at me and said it was not about being right or wrong anymore. She said Mom felt humiliated, Dad felt caught in the middle, and Craig felt like I had turned one bad joke into a permanent family punishment. "That still doesn't tell me what I'm apologizing for," I said. Amanda finally looked up and asked why I was making everything so hard. I told her I was willing to speak directly to Mom if Mom wanted to discuss whether she and Dad were attending the wedding, but I was not going to negotiate through my younger sister. Amanda flinched like I had slapped the table. "So now I'm picking sides too?" she asked. I was already tired, already defensive, and I answered more sharply than I should have. "Then stop carrying messages." She went quiet, finished her coffee faster than usual, and left after telling me she was only trying to keep the family from falling apart. I knew I was right about the boundary, but on the drive home I also knew I had been unfair to her. Amanda had spent years surviving our mother differently than I had, and I was treating that survival strategy like a character flaw. My father called that evening. Mark always preferred conversations after Linda had already done the emotional damage, when he could step in sounding reasonable and ask everyone else to clean it up. He said I could not punish my mother and expect them to smile through my wedding. I reminded him that my mother was still invited and that she was the one who had destroyed the invitation on camera. He answered with the same phrase I had heard my entire life. "Family should be together." I asked him what would happen if Craig came to the wedding and made another comment about Ethan's salary or my money or how lucky Ethan was to marry me. "He won't," Dad said. "That's what everyone said the last 3 times." My father went silent. I told him that was exactly why promises no longer meant much to me unless the person making them was also willing to accept consequences. He said I was becoming rigid and that marriage was supposed to teach compromise. I told him compromise was when 2 people each gave something. What he was asking me to do was absorb Craig's behavior so nobody else had to feel uncomfortable. Dad ended the call by saying he hoped I would remember that weddings were about families joining together. I did not say what I was thinking, which was that mine seemed more interested in deciding who I was allowed to exclude than in the man I was actually marrying. For the next several days, I tried to step away from it. I worked, reviewed the seating chart, confirmed transportation with Ethan, and refused to monitor the family group chat every hour. Then one of my cousins sent me a message asking whether I was coming to the family breakfast on Sunday morning after the wedding. I stared at the screen because I assumed she meant some informal meal I had forgotten about. I asked what breakfast she was talking about, and she replied, "The reconciliation brunch. Your mom said it was still undecided whether you were coming." I read that twice before calling Amanda. She hesitated as soon as I mentioned Sunday. Then she said Mom was trying something positive, and that maybe I should not react before I knew the details. I asked a very simple question. Did I agree to a reconciliation brunch? Amanda said no, but added that Mom thought it would give everyone a chance to talk after emotions settled. I asked whether I had actually been invited, or whether everyone was simply expecting me to appear. Amanda said, "Rachel, please don't turn this into another fight." I told her I was not fighting. I was asking whether someone had scheduled a reconciliation for me without speaking to me. After work, I sat in my car and pulled up my wedding itinerary. Saturday was full from morning until late evening. Sunday had nothing, except checkout times, and a note Ethan and I had made about sleeping in before driving home. There was no brunch, no meeting, no reconciliation. I texted the cousin who had first mentioned it and asked her to send me exactly what she had received. A minute later, a digital invitation appeared on my phone. At the top, In elegant script, it read, Wilson Family Reconciliation Brunch. Beneath that was Sunday at 11 in the morning at the Harbor Crest Hotel. My mother had sent it to extended family without ever asking me whether I would attend. It did not say she and Dad had chosen not to come to my wedding. It did not say Craig was the only person I had excluded. Instead, the wording described the brunch as a chance for our family to come back together after a painful season. Anyone reading it would have assumed both sides had agreed that some terrible mutual rupture needed repairing. I called Amanda again, and this time she admitted Mom was organizing the entire thing herself. When I asked who was paying for it, Amanda said she did not know. I did not call the hotel because it was not my event, and I had no right to ask for someone else's booking information. The part that bothered me was not the brunch itself. My mother was free to eat breakfast with anyone she wanted. What bothered me was that she had already created a public event around my supposed reconciliation before I had agreed there was anything to reconcile. If I showed up, she could present it as proof that I had finally come back to the family. If I stayed away, I had no idea what story she planned to tell about the empty space where I was supposed to be. Until then, I had spent a week wondering whether my mother would come to my wedding. I should have been asking what she planned to do if she didn't. A few nights after I learned about my mother's so-called reconciliation brunch, Ethan and I sat at our dining room table, with the wedding budget open between us. He had been patient through every phone call, every family message, and every new version of the story. But that night he finally pointed at the lodging line and asked the question I knew was coming. We had set aside a little over $11,000 from the wedding savings we had built for more than a year to cover 8 hotel rooms for Friday and Saturday night. Ethan looked at the number, then at me. Why are we still spending that much money on people who are publicly humiliating you? It was a fair question, and I did not have some noble answer about loving my family no matter what. I was angry enough that part of me wanted to cancel every room connected to my parents and let them find somewhere else to stay in Charleston. But the money was already part of a budget we could afford without borrowing, and I did not want revenge to become the reason I broke a promise I had made before any of this happened. More importantly, I could already hear the story my mother would tell if I canceled the rooms. Rachel invited us to Charleston, turned the whole family against Craig, then stranded her own parents days before the wedding. Ethan leaned back in his chair and studied me for a moment. Then what exactly did you promise? He asked. That question cut through weeks of noise more cleanly than anything else had. I looked down at the spreadsheet and realized that my mother kept talking about my promise as if I had signed away the entire weekend, when what Ethan and I had actually offered was very specific. A room, I said, not a lifestyle. Ethan smiled for the first time that evening and said that if that was my boundary, I needed to make sure the hotel understood it as clearly as I did. The next morning, I contacted the group coordinator at the Harbor Crest Hotel. I did not tell her that my mother had shredded my invitation or that half my relatives were behaving like they had been drafted into a civil war. I simply asked for my payment authorization to be put in writing. My card would cover room charges and taxes for the 8 rooms in our block on Friday and Saturday nights. Nothing else. The coordinator explained that every room would be required to provide a card for incidentals at check-in unless one guest chose to establish a separate master folio for additional charges. I confirmed that was exactly what I wanted and asked her to email me a copy. When the authorization arrived, I read it twice before saving it in my wedding folder. Ethan watched me from across the room and asked whether I felt better. I told him I did, although that was only partly true. What I really felt was relieved to have turned something emotional into something measurable. Room and tax belonged to me. Everything else belonged to whoever ordered it. It was the kind of distinction I understood, and for a few days I convinced myself that once the rules were clear, the problem would stop growing. Instead, my mother's version of the weekend began expanding. Amanda sent me screenshots from the family chat because Linda had started talking about spa appointments, cocktails overlooking the harbor, and how nice it would be for everyone to make memories together before the Sunday brunch. I did not respond until I saw a message from Aunt Susan asking whether the spa package was included in what I was paying for. my mother answered. Rachel has always taken care of the family when we travel for her events. She did not technically say yes. That was Linda's specialty. She could create an expectation without ever making a statement she could later be accused of making. I called her directly. I did not ask why she hated me or why she was trying to ruin my wedding, because those were emotional questions that would have given her a dozen ways to change the subject. I asked one thing. Are you telling people I'm paying for spa treatments, food, alcohol, or anything besides their rooms? Linda immediately sounded offended. After everything this family has done for you, you're going to nickel and dime people over a wedding weekend? I told her nobody was being nickel and dimed. The rooms were paid. Anything anyone chose to order after that was their responsibility. She laughed once, but there was nothing amused about it. We'll see how generous you feel after you've embarrassed everyone, she said. I asked what that was supposed to mean, and she told me I knew perfectly well what I had done by excluding Craig and making the family choose sides. I reminded her again that nobody had been asked to choose. She started repeating the same argument about family loyalty, and I stopped her before we could circle the same drain for another 20 minutes. The rooms are paid, I said. The extras are not. That's all I called to clarify. Then I ended the conversation before she could turn my financial boundary into another moral hearing. I was proud of how calm I had stayed, but I also noticed something about myself that I did not particularly like. Every time my mother created another complication, I felt a small burst of satisfaction when I found the cleanest way to close it down. I was beginning to treat my own wedding like an operations problem, and operations problems were where I felt safest. Ethan reminded me that we still had menus to approve, vows to finish, and a marriage to begin. He was right. But part of me kept thinking that if I could just make every boundary precise enough, my mother would eventually run out of room to distort it. A few days later, Amanda stopped by after work with a garment bag I had left at her apartment. She was quieter than usual, and I deliberately avoided asking for family updates because I did not want every conversation with my sister to become intelligence gathering. We were talking about the wedding when she casually mentioned that Mom's photographer was apparently available for the whole Sunday brunch. I thought she meant my wedding photographer and immediately corrected her because I had not booked anyone for Sunday. Amanda shook her head. No, Mom hired someone herself. She wants family pictures after everything is healed. I stared at her long enough that she looked away. Healed by Sunday morning? I asked. Amanda rubbed her thumb along the strap of her purse and said Mom thought people would be emotional after the wedding and the brunch could help everyone move forward. I asked whether anyone had bothered to find out if I intended to attend this emotional healing session. Amanda said nothing for several seconds, which was answer enough. I did not attack her for it. I had already learned that every time I treated Amanda like an extension of our mother, I pushed her deeper into the role I wanted her to leave. The photographer bothered me more than I wanted to admit. A breakfast could be spontaneous. A few relatives could sit around, drink coffee, complain about me, and go home. A separately hired photographer meant my mother wanted something preserved. I still did not know exactly what she intended to do with those photographs, and I reminded myself not to invent motives just because I was angry. But by then, I had begun to recognize a pattern. Linda was no longer planning only around what she wanted me to do. She was planning around how things would look afterward. In early May, the hotel coordinator emailed me again, but this time there was a legitimate reason. Someone connected to my parents had asked the banquet team whether part of the Sunday brunch catering could be placed on my wedding block. Because that request would have moved a new charge onto an account authorized in my name, the coordinator needed my approval before doing anything. She did not tell me what Linda had ordered, how much it cost, or any details of the private brunch contract. She simply asked whether I authorized Sunday banquet charges to be transferred to my account. I replied in writing so there could be no misunderstanding. No, my authorization remains room and tax only. No banquet, spa, food, beverage, or other incidentals. The coordinator confirmed that nothing would be changed and that any separate event would remain separate from my account. I saved that email beside the original authorization and closed my laptop. I did not call my mother. I did not threaten to cancel anything. I had made the boundary clear, and I was done arguing about it. What stayed with me was not the attempted charge. It was the photographer. My mother had now built a brunch, a family narrative, and a set of professional photographs around a reconciliation I had never agreed to attend. A reconciliation normally requires two people willing to sit at the same table. My mother had already booked hers, before she even knew whether I would show up. About 2 weeks before the wedding, Uncle Craig sent me a text I never expected to receive. He asked if I would meet him for coffee somewhere without my mother present, adding that he was tired of hearing his name used in conversations he had not started. My first instinct was to delete the message. I had no interest in negotiating his invitation, and I was not looking for another family member to explain why I had overreacted. But rumors were still spreading through the family, and almost every version seemed to begin with Craig. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near my office, not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I wanted to hear directly from the man everyone claimed this entire boycott was about. Craig was already sitting near the window when I arrived. He did not stand to hug me, and I was grateful for that. Before I had even taken off my coat, he said, "I still think you overreacted." I stared at him and almost laughed. He had requested the meeting, watched our family tear itself apart for weeks, and somehow decided his opening move should be to tell me I was too sensitive. I reminded him that the comment at our engagement dinner had not been the first one. He shrugged and said he had always joked that way, which was exactly the problem. "You keep saying it was a joke as if that means everyone else is required to enjoy it," I told him. "You embarrassed Ethan at our engagement dinner after I had already asked you to stop. That is why you are not coming." Craig leaned back and crossed his arms. "Fine," he said. "Don't invite me." The answer was so blunt that for a second I thought I had misheard him. I asked why. If he had accepted that, my parents were refusing to attend because of him. Craig frowned and said, "They're not refusing because of me." I told him that was exactly what Linda had been telling everyone, that I was forcing her to choose between her daughter and her brother. His expression shifted from irritation to something closer to disbelief. "I never asked your mother to choose anything," he said. "Actually, I told her the opposite." He took out his phone and scrolled through his messages with Linda. I did not ask to take the phone from him. He turned the screen toward me and let me read. The text was dated the day after the engagement dinner. Craig had written, "She doesn't want me there. Fine. Go to your daughter's wedding. Don't make this bigger because of me." My mother's reply came several minutes later. "This is not about you. This is about what Rachel is doing to the family." Craig had answered that he thought I was being dramatic, but he repeated that Linda should go to the wedding and leave him out of it. There was no demand that she boycott, no ultimatum, no secret plan between them. I looked up at him and said, "You could have told people this weeks ago." He gave me an irritated look and asked why it was his job to defend me when I had banned him from my wedding. It was such a selfish answer that I felt almost relieved. Craig had not secretly transformed into a decent man. He was still proud, defensive, and unwilling to apologize unless forced. But that also made what I was reading more believable. He was not showing me the texts because he suddenly cared about my reputation. He was showing me because he was angry that Linda had turned him into the reason for a war he had never requested. I asked him to scroll back a little farther. One message from my mother caught my attention because it mentioned Sunday. She had written, "We already have Sunday photos. Maybe by then she'll come to her senses." I checked the timestamp. Friday afternoon, April 3rd. My mother had written it hours before she sat at her dining room table, held my invitation in front of a camera, and tore it into pieces. I asked Craig what Sunday photos she meant. He said he had assumed she was talking about some family breakfast after the wedding, and had not cared enough to ask. He had not known there would be a photographer or a formal reconciliation brunch until other relatives started discussing it. That timestamp changed the shape of the entire conflict for me. Until then, I had assumed the brunch was something Linda created after the video went through the family group, and people began choosing sides. But she had already been talking about Sunday photographs before she publicly destroyed the invitation. I was careful not to turn that into more than it proved. It did not mean she had designed every detail of some elaborate victim performance in advance. It did mean the video had not been one spontaneous burst of maternal heartbreak. By the time she filmed it, she already had another family gathering and another set of photographs waiting on the other side of my wedding. Craig watched me reread the messages and said, "I think you're giving her too much credit. Your mother gets dramatic when she doesn't get her way." I told him that might be true, but drama usually burned itself out. Linda's behavior was becoming more organized every time I said no. First, she wanted Craig invited. Then she threatened not to attend. Then came the video, the family messages, the Sunday brunch, and now professional photographs. Craig rubbed his forehead and said he had assumed she was venting when she called him after our engagement dinner. He had not realized she was telling relatives I was forcing everyone to take sides. Before we left, I told him nothing about our conversation changed his status with me. He was still not invited. He gave a short nod and said, "I know." There was no apology, but for the first time since the engagement dinner, he was accepting the consequence without trying to negotiate it away. Then he looked at me and said something I did not want to hear from him because I knew immediately that it was true. "Your mother wasn't trying to get me invited, Rachel. She was trying to make you surrender." I carried that sentence home with me. Ethan was making dinner when I walked into the kitchen, and I told him everything Craig had shown me. I explained that Craig had actually told Linda to attend the wedding, and I showed Ethan the screenshot Craig had allowed me to take of the message. Then I told him about the Friday timestamp and the Sunday photographs. Ethan listened without interrupting until I finally said, "This was never really about getting Craig into the room." "Then what does she want?" he asked. I sat at the counter and thought about every argument my mother and I had had since the engagement dinner. She had never offered a solution where she attended the wedding while disagreeing with my decision. She had never asked how Ethan felt. She had never even spent much time defending Craig's actual comment. Everything came back to one thing. I had made a family decision without her permission and refused to reverse it after she applied pressure. If I invited Craig again, Linda could show the family that she had restored order. If I did not, she needed everyone to believe my refusal was proof that I was the person dividing us. That realization frightened me more than Craig's insults ever had, because insults were simple. I knew how to deal with someone who said something cruel to my face. My mother was doing something harder to fight. She was turning my boundary into a story about my character, and she was building the audience before I even understood the performance. I had spent weeks asking why she was willing to miss her daughter's wedding for her brother. I finally understood that Craig was not the prize she was protecting. Her authority was. Craig had lit the match at our engagement dinner. He deserved the consequence he got for that, and I never changed my mind about keeping him away from the wedding. But as I sat beside Ethan that night, looking at a message my uncle had sent before my mother ever shredded the invitation, I realized Craig was not the person carrying that match through the rest of the house. My mother was. 10 days before the wedding, Amanda sent me a PDF without any explanation. I was at work when it arrived, and the file name was simply Wilson Family Weekend. I waited until lunch to open it because I had promised myself I would stop letting my mother interrupt every working day. The itinerary was polished enough to look like something prepared for a corporate retreat. Friday included check-in and drinks at the Harbor Crest. Saturday listed breakfast, sightseeing, and family time during the exact hours Ethan and I would be getting married. Sunday morning was labeled Reconciliation Brunch, with flowers, professional family photographs, and a seat reserved for me at the main table. At the bottom was a note asking everyone to dress in coordinated neutrals for pictures. I called Amanda immediately and asked where she got it. She admitted Mom had sent it to the family weeks earlier and told her, "Don't send this to your sister. It will ruin the gesture." "When did she send it?" I asked. Amanda hesitated before saying it had been circulating before Mom shredded my invitation. That matched what Craig had shown me, but seeing the full itinerary made the sequence harder to dismiss. Linda had already been organizing Sunday before she filmed herself, tearing my invitation apart. I scrolled through the forwarded email chain and found a short exchange with the photographer. Part of it was cut off, but I could see that the photographer had asked Linda how she wanted the family arranged if I did not appear. I could not see Linda's full response, and I refused to pretend I knew what it said. I asked Amanda if there were more messages. She said probably, but she did not want to start searching through Mom's phone or forwarding every private conversation she found. "I don't want to become your spy," she said. I told her I did not want that either, and I meant it. Then Amanda said something that made the itinerary feel much less innocent. A few days earlier, Linda had left her a voicemail after another argument about the wedding. According to Amanda, Mom had said, "If Rachel doesn't come down Sunday, people will finally see who is refusing this family." I asked Amanda to send me the voicemail. She went quiet. When I asked again, she said she was not ready. "She's still my mother," she said. "Sending you her private voicemail feels like betraying her." Something in me snapped. I told Amanda that Mom had been using her to carry messages for weeks, that she knew people were being told different versions of the same story, and that keeping evidence hidden was helping Mom continue doing it. Amanda's face changed. "You've been helping her," I said. And even as the words came out, I knew they were harsher than they needed to be. Amanda stared at me for a few seconds before answering. "You think being the strong sister means you were the only one scared of her?" That stopped me. She told me I had always been the one who argued with Mom because I could tolerate the consequences better. Amanda learned to survive by agreeing, delaying, changing the subject, and carrying messages because it kept the temperature down. She said none of that made her proud, but it did not mean she had spent 33 years enjoying the position I was criticizing her for. I wanted to defend myself, but there was nothing useful to defend. I apologized. I told her I had been so focused on seeing who was helping Mom that I had stopped seeing what it cost Amanda to be caught between us. She nodded, but she still did not send me the voicemail, and this time, I did not ask again. That evening, I created a folder on my computer. It started with the video of Mom shredding the invitation. Then, I saved the email, confirming my parents' seats were still reserved, the hotel authorization, Craig's screenshot telling Linda to attend my wedding without him, the family itinerary, and the messages relatives had forwarded, showing how Mom had described the conflict differently depending on who she was talking to. Building the folder felt natural to me. I organized information for a living, and for the first time in weeks I could see the conflict as a sequence instead of a storm. April 2nd, Craig crossed the line. April 3rd, Mom was already discussing Sunday photographs. April 3rd that evening, she shredded my invitation. After that came the changing family stories, the brunch invitation, the photographer, and the attempt to put banquet charges on my account. The problem was that once I built the folder, I could not stop opening it. I started imagining what I would do if Mom posted another video. I could release everything at once. The screenshots, the timestamps, Craig's message, the hotel emails. I could make it impossible for anyone to claim they did not know what happened. Ethan found me sitting in our home office after midnight, with the folder open on one screen and our seating chart untouched on the other. He leaned against the doorway and asked, "Are you trying to protect our wedding, or are you prosecuting your mother?" I did not like the question because it was too accurate. "I want facts," I said. My voice came out colder than I intended. Ethan nodded and said, "Facts matter. I'm asking how much of our wedding you want to spend proving them." I closed the laptop, but I did not answer him right away. My mother had spent weeks turning my boundary into evidence against me, and I wanted the comfort of knowing I could destroy that narrative whenever I chose. What I had not noticed was how much attention I was already giving her. Ethan and I were 10 days from getting married, and instead of arguing over cake flavors or laughing about seating mistakes, I was maintaining an evidence archive about my own parents. I finally told him he was right about one thing. I was letting Linda determine what I looked at every night. I did not delete the folder. That would have been foolish. I simply decided it would remain evidence, not become my hobby. A few days later, Linda called me. Her voice was softer than it had been since the engagement dinner, which immediately made me suspicious. She said there was still time to fix what I'd done, before everybody traveled to Charleston. I asked her the only question that mattered. If Craig is not invited, are you and Dad coming to the wedding? Linda did not say yes or no. She talked about humiliation, loyalty, and how impossible I had made things for her. I asked again, "Are you coming if Craig isn't?" She said, "I will not walk into a room where my own daughter has humiliated my family and pretend everything is normal." "Then this isn't about family," I said. "It's about winning." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Linda finally told me I would regret saying that and hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand and realized she had given me the clearest answer I was ever going to get. She could attend my wedding. Her seat was there. Dad's seat was there. The only thing preventing her from coming was that attending without Craig would look, to her, like admitting my boundary had survived her pressure. I did not call back. On Monday, May 11th, I sent the Harbor Crest my final written payment authorization. 8 rooms, Friday and Saturday nights. Room charges and taxes only. No banquet charges, no spa, no food, no alcohol, no incidentals, and no transfers without my written approval. The coordinator confirmed it, and I saved the email in the same folder as everything else. Then I closed the folder and went to my final dress, fitting with Ethan, waiting afterward to take me to dinner. I still knew what my mother was doing, and I still had the documents to prove what I knew. But for the first time in weeks, I stopped trying to control what story she might tell next and started paying attention to the life I was actually about to begin. By then, I understood enough to see the shape of the trap. The brunch could work for my mother whether I appeared or stayed away, because either choice could be turned into another family story. What I did not understand yet was that escaping it would have nothing to do with finding the perfect argument. It would come from finally refusing to control what happened inside a game I had never agreed to play. By Friday afternoon, Ethan and I had already been in Charleston for nearly a day. We had driven down from Raleigh on Thursday, checked into our own hotel, met with the coordinator, and spent the evening doing the kind of ordinary wedding work I had almost forgotten I was supposed to be enjoying. Place cards, flowers, last-minute seating changes. A missing box of favors that turned out to be in the wrong storage room. For a few hours, those problems felt almost luxurious because none of them involved my mother. The Harbor Crest coordinator sent me a routine note that afternoon, confirming that all 8 prepaid reservations in my family block were still active under the authorization I had already signed. She did not tell me who had checked in, what room anyone had, or what they were doing. I did not ask. A little later, Amanda texted me herself. Mom and Dad were there. Aunt Susan had arrived. Several cousins had checked in. Linda had gathered everyone in the lounge for drinks before dinner. I asked Amanda if she was okay. I did not ask what Mom was saying about me. That was deliberate. I was trying to spend the last 24 hours before my wedding as a bride, instead of a full-time investigator into my own family. Amanda told me much later how the incidentals were set up. At check-in, the front desk asked each room to provide a card for anything beyond the prepaid room and tax. A couple of older relatives hesitated, apparently because they had assumed I was covering the entire weekend. Linda stepped in and said Mark could put the extras on one master folio because I always settled family travel costs after an event. My father actually asked whether she was sure I would reimburse him. Linda told him I was angry now, but I would never embarrass the family over money once the wedding was finished. Then my father signed the authorization himself and handed over his card. No one stole his card. No employee made a mistake. No charge was secretly attached to me. Mark made an adult decision because he believed the pattern of our family would continue the way it always had. Linda could spend. Other people could assume. Dad could smooth things over. And eventually I would make the numbers disappear. The next morning brought me back to the moment where I started telling this story. I was in the bridal suite, 3 hours from marrying Ethan, when I saw my mother's Instagram story from the Harbor Crest lounge. Champagne glasses, smiling relatives. The caption about family sticking together when someone chose to leave them. Before I could decide whether to laugh or throw my phone across the room, the front desk called. Someone associated with the family block had asked whether a group of incidental charges currently sitting on my father's master folio could be transferred to my wedding account. Because that change would have affected an account in my name, the hotel needed my approval. They did not tell me who had ordered what or how much had already accumulated. They simply asked if I authorized the transfer. No, I said. Room and tax only, no transfers. The coordinator, the coordinator confirmed that my original authorization would remain unchanged. My account would pay exactly what I had promised. My father's signed folio would continue carrying whatever extras he had agreed to cover. I thanked her, ended the call, and handed my phone to my maid of honor. Unless the building is on fire or Ethan has disappeared, I told her, I don't want this back until after the ceremony. She slipped it into her bag without asking questions. I had imagined my wedding aisle many times before that day. I had imagined the flowers, Ethan waiting at the end, the music, the moment everyone stood. I had never imagined measuring the distance between myself and two empty chairs. My parents' seats were still there exactly where they had always been on the seating plan. I had refused every suggestion to move someone else into them, not because I wanted to create a dramatic symbol, but because I had meant what I wrote in that email. Their seats were reserved. They could have walked in at any point before the ceremony and sat down. They chose not to. I saw those chairs just before I started down the aisle. For one ugly second, all the confidence I had built over the previous 6 weeks disappeared. My hands went cold. My chest tightened, and I thought about all the ordinary wedding moments that would never happen. My father would not walk over after the ceremony and tell me I looked beautiful. My mother would not complain about my flowers, then cry during the vows anyway. There would be no family picture where I stood between them. I had spent weeks insisting their absence was their choice, and I still discovered that being right did not make the choice hurt less. Then I looked at Ethan. He was standing at the other end of the aisle with the same nervous smile he had worn at our rehearsal. He was not looking at the empty chairs. He was looking at me. So I stopped looking at the door. The ceremony was not perfect. One of Ethan's friends dropped a program. My veil caught briefly on the edge of a chair. I stumbled over one line of my vows because my voice shook harder than I expected. But when Ethan took my hands, I realized perfection had never been what I needed. I needed one room where I was not required to abandon my own judgment in order to keep someone else comfortable. We got married without my parents, and I was happy. I was also heartbroken. Those two things existed at the same time, which would have confused the version of me who had spent most of her life trying to make every feeling fit into a clean category. During the reception, I laughed until my cheeks hurt. I danced with Ethan. I ate half a piece of cake because people kept pulling me away from the table. Then, without warning, I would notice someone else's mother fixing her daughter's hair, or someone's father leaning over to whisper something during dinner, and grief would rise again. Ethan never told me I was better off without them. I think that was one of the reasons I loved him. At one point he found me standing near the terrace doors, watching the lights on the water, and asked if I was okay. I am, I said. And I'm not. He nodded. You can be both. That was all. Several relatives who had originally planned to attend were missing, but others came anyway. Aunt Susan arrived and hugged me too tightly without mentioning my mother. A cousin who had previously sent me one of Linda's messages showed up with her husband and quietly said she was glad she had come. Nobody gave me a dramatic public apology. I did not need one. I was beginning to understand that people often changed more slowly than stories did. Amanda arrived after dinner. I saw her standing near the entrance in a dark blue dress, looking like someone who had spent 20 minutes sitting in a car, arguing with herself before walking inside. She found me before I could decide whether to go to her. Mom doesn't know I'm here, she said. A few weeks earlier, I might have hugged her immediately out of relief. Instead, there was a pause between us. Too many messages had passed through her. Too many times, she had asked me to fix something she had not created. She seemed to understand that. I couldn't stay there anymore, she said. They kept talking about how you chose strangers over your family. I looked around the reception room. Ethan's parents were laughing with one of my coworkers. My college roommate was dancing badly with her husband. Two cousins from my mother's side were standing near the bar. "Those aren't strangers," I said. "I know." Amanda looked down for a moment, before telling me she was sorry for carrying Mom's messages for so long. She said she had convinced herself that being the messenger was better than letting Linda call me directly and start another fight, but eventually she realized she was helping keep the same system alive. I told her I was sorry too. I had treated her like she was choosing Mom's side, when sometimes she had simply been trying to avoid being crushed between us. "I still should have stopped sooner," she said. "Maybe," I told her. "But you stopped. That mattered more to me." We stood together for a few minutes, before Amanda glanced toward the hallway and lowered her voice. She told me there was something else I needed to know, though she was not sure whether I would care tonight. At the Harbor Crest, Linda had been encouraging everyone to charge their spa treatments, room service, and lounge drinks to Dad's master folio. She kept telling people not to worry, because I would reimburse him once I calmed down. I asked one question: "Did Dad sign it himself?" Amanda nodded. "Yes. He asked her if you were really going to pay him back. Mom said you always do." That answer settled something inside me. For most of my adult life, whenever Linda created a mess, Mark had called me afterward and explained why it would be easier if I just helped fix it. He had spent years acting as though his decision to avoid conflict somehow made him separate from the consequences of it. This time, he had put his own name on the paper. I did not call the hotel and tell them to stop accepting his card. It was not my card. I did not call Dad and warn him what Mom was doing. He had asked. She had answered. He had signed anyway. I simply borrowed my phone long enough to reopen the written authorization saved in my email and confirm that nothing had changed on my side. Room and tax only. Then I handed the phone back and returned to my wedding. My father had spent years telling me to absorb whatever my mother created. That night, for once, the account was in his name. The next morning, Ethan and I were eating breakfast at a small cafe a few blocks from the harbor when my father called. I almost let it go to voicemail because we had promised each other one quiet meal before driving back to Raleigh, but Mark called again less than 30 seconds later. When I answered, he did not say good morning. He said, "The hotel put $17,800 on my card." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood him. "For the rooms?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Dad snapped that the rooms had been paid exactly as promised. The $17,800 was everything else. Spa treatments, salon appointments, room service, bottles of champagne, drinks in the lounge, minibar charges, gratuities, service fees, and taxes had all been collected under the master incidental folio he signed when the family checked in. He sounded less angry at the hotel than at me, which told me immediately where the conversation was going. Later, when he sent me the itemized folio to prove how outrageous the bill was, I understood how it had climbed so high. There were spa and salon charges, for several relatives, that together came to nearly $6,000. Food and room service across the 8 rooms added thousands more. Champagne and lounge charges took another large piece, followed by minibar purchases, automatic gratuities, service charges, and taxes. Nobody had ordered a diamond necklace or done anything impossible. They had simply spent 2 days in a 5-star hotel behaving as though someone else had promised to make the total disappear. Amanda later told me Mom had encouraged it constantly. Whenever someone hesitated over the price of something, Linda said some version of, "We're already here. We should enjoy ourselves." Dad told me I needed to call the hotel immediately and move the charges to my card. I asked why. His voice sharpened. "Because you invited everyone here, Rachel. This was your wedding weekend." I reminded him that several of those people had chosen not to attend my wedding at all. He said that was beside the point and that I had promised to host the family. I noticed the word change immediately. For 6 weeks, the promise had been hotel rooms. Now that the extras had become expensive, the promise had somehow expanded into hosting. I opened my laptop on the cafe table while Ethan quietly moved his coffee out of the way. I found the May 11th email from the Harbor Crest and read the authorization exactly as it was written. My card covered the 8 designated rooms, room charges, and applicable room taxes for Friday and Saturday nights. It specifically excluded food, alcohol, spa services, banquet charges, minibar purchases, room service, and all other incidentals. There had been no ambiguity. The hotel had even contacted me the previous morning when someone tried to move charges from Dad's folio onto my account, and I had denied the transfer. Dad was silent for a moment, then said, "Your mother told me you would settle the rest afterward." I looked across the table at Ethan, who said nothing. "Did Mom sign the incidental authorization?" I asked. "No." "Did I?" Another pause. "No. Did you?" His breath came out hard enough for me to hear through the phone. "Yes, but I only did that because Linda said, 'Dad, did you sign it?'" "Yes." I closed the laptop. Then I paid exactly what I promised. He accused me of setting them up. That was the first moment I actually became angry. Not loud, not dramatic, but genuinely angry. I told him I had put the boundary in writing before they traveled. I had repeated it to Mom. I had repeated it to the hotel. When someone tried to move incidentals to my account, I had refused again. Nothing about the bill had been hidden from him, except the one thing he had chosen to trust without verifying. My mother's claim that I would eventually rescue him from his own signature. "You know how your mother is," Dad said. I had heard those words since I was old enough to understand family arguments. They had excused, missed apologies, cruel comments, embarrassing scenes, last-minute demands, and dozens of smaller things I could no longer remember individually. The sentence had always meant the same thing. Linda would not change, so someone else had to. Usually that someone was me. "Yes," I said. "I do know how she is. You know too, and you signed anyway." Dad said I was making a point at their expense. I told him I had not spent $1 of his money. He had. He argued that I could afford to help and that refusing now was cruel after everyone had traveled so far. I reminded him that their rooms were already paid, just as I had promised. What he was asking me to do was pay for choices made after I had explicitly said I would not pay for them. He kept circling back to how humiliating it would be for relatives to learn that he was responsible for the whole bill. I finally told him that if embarrassment was the problem, he should probably stop calling people until he decided what he actually wanted to say. That ended the conversation. I expected to feel triumphant after I hung up. For weeks, I had imagined the moment when one of my parents finally discovered that my boundaries were not suggestions. But sitting there with Ethan while my breakfast went cold, I felt more tired than victorious. There was satisfaction in knowing I had protected myself without cheating anyone, but I did not enjoy hearing fear in my father's voice. He and my mother were financially comfortable enough that $17,800 would not destroy them, but it was still a painful amount of money. He would have to pull from savings, and for once there was no daughter waiting to erase the consequence. The story changed before we even left the cafe. Aunt Susan texted me asking whether I had really dumped an $18,000 hotel bill on my parents after promising to host the family. 10 minutes later, a cousin sent me a screenshot of a post from Mom. Linda had written that she and Dad had honored every commitment they made for my wedding weekend, only to be deliberately left with a humiliating bill by the daughter who had invited everyone there. She did not claim I had failed to pay for the rooms, because that would have been easy to disprove. She simply used the word host, letting everyone else decide what it was supposed to include. The amount did the rest of the work for her. $17,800 sounded shocking without context, and shock was useful. People who had not seen the authorization started asking why I would do something so vindictive to my own father. One relative wrote that whatever had happened with Craig, money should never be used to punish family. I stared at that message and almost laughed at the irony. I had done exactly the opposite. I had refused to use money as punishment, which was why their hotel rooms had remained paid in the first place. For the first time, though, I understood how easily a satisfying consequence could become another piece of my mother's victim story. The hotel bill proved my boundary had been real. Linda was already using the same bill to prove I was cruel. I could have responded immediately with the authorization and Dad's signature, but I did not. Not yet. I had spent too much of my wedding weekend reacting on my mother's schedule, and I refused to let Sunday morning become another emergency simply because Linda had posted something online. Then Amanda texted me. The reconciliation brunch was still happening at 11. Mom had refused to cancel it even after the argument with Dad and the hotel bill. The photographer was already there. According to Amanda, Linda had told everyone, "We're not letting Rachel ruin one more thing." A few minutes later, another message arrived with a photograph attached. The brunch room was elegant and bright, with flowers arranged along a long table and champagne glasses waiting beside white plates. My mother was seated near the center. Beside her was an empty chair. A place card sat in front of it. Rachel. I stared at the photograph longer than I had stared at my parents' empty seats the day before. Those chairs at my wedding had represented a choice they made. This chair was different. My mother had created it herself, placed my name in front of it, and surrounded it with a photographer and an audience. The $17,800 bill had proved my boundary. By 11 that morning, my mother was already using my absence to prove something else. The photograph Amanda sent me stayed on my screen long after I understood what I was looking at. The room was bright, tasteful, expensive, without being flashy. White flowers ran down the center of the table. Champagne glasses caught the morning light. My mother was seated near the middle, with relatives gathered around her, and beside her was the empty chair with my name on the place card. The hotel bill had made me angry because my father wanted me to pay for choices I had clearly refused to fund. That chair made me angry for a different reason. My mother was no longer merely explaining my absence. She had turned it into a prop. At my wedding, my parents' empty chairs had existed because they chose not to come. At Linda's brunch, she had created my empty chair herself, so she could decide what it meant. I opened the evidence folder I had promised myself I would stop staring at. A new message from Amanda arrived almost immediately. She had forwarded the rest of the photographer thread she had refused to search for 10 days earlier. She explained that she had not gone through Mom's phone. The photographer had resent the final schedule that morning to several family members who were listed as contacts, and Amanda was one of them. Buried beneath the arrival time and group photo instructions was the line I had not been able to see before. If Rachel does not attend, keep one seat open near immediate family for a few family-only shots. I checked the timestamp on the original instruction. It had been finalized after Mom decided she and Dad would boycott the wedding, but before we arrived in Charleston, the brunch and photographer had existed even earlier, before the video of my invitation being torn apart, but the empty chair instruction had come later. My mother had not planned every detail from the beginning. She had adapted as the conflict grew. That somehow made it worse. I could no longer tell myself she had simply organized a breakfast and later gotten carried away. She had watched me refuse to surrender, then deliberately prepared for my absence to be photographed. If I came downstairs, she could take pictures of the family reunited. If I did not, she could photograph the place where I was supposed to be. Either way, the camera had something to capture. I was still staring at the thread when Amanda sent another message. "I'm sending you the voicemail now," she wrote. "I don't want to hold this anymore." A few seconds later, an audio file appeared. I put in my earbuds before pressing play. My mother sounded tired, not furious, which made the words more disturbing. She told Amanda she was done chasing me and said, "If she doesn't come down Sunday, people will finally see who is really refusing this family." There was no shouting, no threat, nothing criminal or dramatic. It was simply Linda explaining what she expected my absence to accomplish. The brunch was not only an attempt to reconcile, it was a test designed for an audience. If I appeared, my mother could claim her pressure had worked. If I stayed away, she could point to the empty chair and tell everyone I had rejected one final chance to make things right. I replayed the voicemail once, then stopped myself from listening again. Within 15 minutes, I had my laptop open and was writing the response I had imagined for weeks. I attached the video of Mom shredding my invitation. I added screenshots of the different stories she had told relatives. I added Craig's message, telling her to attend my wedding without him. I included the photographer instruction, the voicemail, and my hotel authorization showing exactly what I had agreed to pay. I wrote paragraph after paragraph laying out the timeline from the engagement dinner to the $17,800 bill. By the time I finished, the post was devastating. No reasonable person could have read it without understanding exactly what my mother had done. Ethan read it from the chair beside me. He did not tell me to delete it. He did not say my mother deserved privacy after spending 6 weeks attacking me publicly. He simply asked, "Do you want to hurt her, or do you want the truth to be undeniable?" I looked at him and said, "What's the difference at this point?" He nodded toward the screen. "If you post all of that, half the conversation becomes whether you should have shared her voicemail, whether private messages were taken out of context, whether the photographer meant something else, whether you're humiliating your own mother. People will argue about the evidence instead of the thing you're trying to prove." I hated how quickly I understood him. I had built the perfect case because building cases made me feel safe. Every screenshot closed a possible escape route. Every timestamp answered another argument. But the more material I posted, the more opportunities I gave my mother to change the subject. She could say Amanda betrayed her. She could accuse Craig of sharing private conversations. She could call the photographer's note harmless logistics. She could turn the hotel authorization into another discussion about money. Suddenly, I saw what I had almost done. I was preparing to answer every accusation my mother might ever make, instead of answering the one she had actually made. "What would you post?" I asked Ethan. He shook his head. "It's not my mother. You decide." That mattered. He had given me a question, not an instruction. I went back through the draft and began deleting. The voicemail disappeared first. Then the photographer thread. Then the hotel emails, the family screenshots, and Craig's message. I saved copies because evidence did not become useless just because I chose not to publish it, but I stopped treating possession of evidence as an obligation to expose everything. In the end, I kept 2 files ready. The first was the video of Linda tearing my invitation apart. The second was the email I had sent both my parents weeks earlier. "Your seats remain reserved. If you change your minds, you are welcome to attend. Craig will not be added." Those 2 pieces answered one question cleanly. Had I prevented my parents from attending my wedding? No. Everything else could wait unless it became necessary. I closed the draft without posting anything. For years, I had confused competence with control. If I knew enough, documented enough, planned enough, I believed I could prevent people from twisting reality around me. That morning, I finally understood that judgment sometimes meant having 10 pieces of evidence and using 2. The goal was not to leave my mother with nowhere to hide. The goal was to refuse to follow her into every hiding place. A notification appeared from the family group before I could close my laptop. Linda had posted several professional photographs from the brunch. In one, everyone stood behind the table, while my empty chair remained visible near the center. Her caption read, "We came hoping Rachel would let us back into her life. Some doors can only be opened from the inside." It was carefully phrased. She still had not said I had canceled their seats or forbidden them from attending. She was letting the image do the work. My fingers moved toward the 2 files I had just saved, but I stopped because she had not yet made the claim they answered. I was done arguing with implications. Then Aunt Susan replied in the family chat. "Linda, didn't Rachel leave your seats open?" I stared at the message. For nearly 6 weeks, Susan had been asking me to compromise because she believed my mother's version of what happened. Now she was asking Linda a question, instead of asking me to fix the answer. A small scene indicator appeared beneath the message. Dad had read it. For once, he did not immediately tell everyone to calm down. Another notification arrived. Craig had entered the conversation. He wrote, "She did. Their seats were still there." Amanda sent me a private text from the hallway outside the brunch room. "Mom just saw the chat." I waited for the response I had been trained to expect. Linda was always quickest when a family story needed correcting. She would say Susan misunderstood. She would explain that technically the seats existed, but emotionally she had been excluded. She would redirect the discussion toward Craig, Ethan, respect, loyalty, or the hotel bill. I knew every path because I had watched her use them for years. The typing indicator appeared beneath my mother's name, disappeared, then appeared again. Nobody else wrote anything. For the first time since the engagement dinner, my relatives were waiting for Linda to explain herself instead of waiting for me to surrender. Then Aunt Susan asked one question in the family chat, and for the first time in 6 weeks, my mother didn't have the fastest answer. My mother finally answered Aunt Susan's question 3 minutes later. I know, because I watched the timestamp appear beneath her message while Ethan sat beside me in the hotel room, both of us still dressed casually from breakfast. Linda wrote, "A seat means nothing when your own daughter has made it clear you are not welcome unless you betray your family." It was the first time she had stopped speaking in vague phrases about closed doors and painful choices. Now she was saying plainly that I had made attendance impossible. I read the message twice before opening the folder on my laptop. I did not attach the voicemail. I did not attach the photographer instructions, the hotel authorization, or every screenshot I had collected. I uploaded the video Linda had posted herself, the one where she looked directly into the camera and shredded my invitation while Dad sat beside her. Under it, I attached the email I had sent both of them the next morning. The timestamp was visible. So were the words. "Your seats remain reserved. If you change your minds, you are welcome to attend. Craig will not be added. I won't debate this further." I added one sentence beneath the 2 files. This is what I said, and this is what happened. Then I put the phone down. For almost 6 weeks, I had imagined defending myself with paragraphs. Instead, the silence after those 2 pieces of evidence felt stronger than anything I could have written. Aunt Susan responded first. She quoted the line about my parents' seats remaining reserved and asked Linda why she had told her I had withdrawn their invitation. One of my cousins immediately replied that Linda had told him something different, that Ethan had refused to let my parents attend, unless Craig apologized publicly. Another relative said she had been told my parents were still deciding whether to attend because I had restricted the family guest list at the last minute. The details were close enough to sound like variations of the same conflict, but different enough that people finally noticed what I had been seeing for weeks. My mother had not invented 5 completely separate stories. She had taken the same fact Craig was not invited and adjusted the meaning depending on who was listening. To Susan, I was forcing a sister to abandon her brother. To Amanda, I was pushing my parents away. To distant relatives, Ethan was isolating me. To social media, I was the daughter who had chosen a new family over the old one. Each version protected the same conclusion. Linda was not choosing to miss my wedding. I was somehow making her miss it. Craig entered the chat again. This time he posted the screenshot he had shown me at the coffee shop. "She doesn't want me there. Fine, go to your daughter's wedding. Don't make this bigger because of me." Then he wrote, "I'm not pretending Rachel and I agree. We don't. I still think she overreacted. But I never asked Linda or Mark to skip the wedding." That message mattered precisely because Craig was not defending my personality. He was not suddenly claiming I had been kind or reasonable about everything. He was correcting one fact. My mother responded that private messages were being taken out of context. She accused Craig of betraying her and asked why everyone was attacking her after what I had done. Then Amanda wrote something I never expected to see in the family chat. "Rachel never told Mom and Dad they couldn't attend. I carried messages between them for weeks. I should not have done that, but she never asked me to choose between her and Mom either." Linda replied almost immediately, "Amanda, you have no idea what was said privately." Amanda answered, "I know what you asked me to tell her." That was when the conversation stopped being about me. Aunt Susan posted a screenshot of a message Linda had sent her saying I had taken back my parents' place at the wedding. A cousin posted another, where Linda said my parents could technically attend, but would be forced to sit there while Rachel humiliated Craig in front of everyone. Someone else asked why Linda had organized a reconciliation brunch if she believed I had completely rejected the family. The questions began arriving faster than my mother could redirect them. Amanda called me from outside the brunch room. She sounded shaken but not frightened. "She's furious," she said. I asked if she wanted me to come down. "No." Her answer was immediate. "Please don't. This isn't yours to fix." Those words hit me harder than I expected. Amanda told me what happened next, and later Aunt Susan and Dad independently filled in details, so I learned the rest without pretending I had been in the room. Susan had asked Linda directly whether she knew my parents' seats were still available on Saturday. Linda said that was not the point. Susan asked what the point was. Linda started talking about Craig, respect, and the hotel bill. Craig interrupted and reminded everyone that he had told her to attend without him. Then Susan said the sentence that eventually traveled through the family almost as quickly as the original conflict had. "We're not twisting anything, Linda. We're comparing notes." According to Amanda, the room went quiet. My mother tried to end the conversation by saying the brunch was supposed to be about healing, not accusations. Susan asked why a photographer had been hired for healing that I had never agreed to attend. That was when Amanda showed the photographer's final schedule to the relatives closest to her, including the instruction about leaving my chair open if I did not appear. She did not play the voicemail. She did not need to. The empty chair was sitting right beside my mother. Dad later told me that was the moment he stopped looking at the family chat and looked at Linda instead. He had known she was angry. He had known she wanted me to change my mind. What he had not understood was how much preparation had gone into making my refusal visible to everyone else. He asked her whether the empty chair had been her idea. Linda said the photographer needed a backup plan. Dad asked why the backup plan involved my name sitting in the middle of a photograph. Linda accused him of turning against her. Dad did what he had almost never done in my childhood. He did not tell someone else to calm her down. A few relatives began leaving before brunch ended. The photographer packed up earlier than planned, after Susan told her they would not be doing the remaining group photographs. Craig left after telling Linda he was done being used as the reason she skipped my wedding. Amanda walked out shortly afterward. Susan stayed long enough to tell my father she would call him later, then left too. My mother had arranged a room full of people to witness my absence. Instead, they witnessed one another's evidence. Dad called me that afternoon. His voice was quieter than it had been when he demanded I pay the $17,800 bill. He did not apologize immediately. That would have been too easy for him. He said he had not realized Linda had told different people different things. I asked whether he had seen the email about their seats before the wedding. "Yes," he said. "Then you knew you were invited." He tried to explain that Mom had made attendance feel impossible. I told him feelings could explain his choice, but they could not change the fact that it had been his choice. He went silent, and for once I did not fill the silence for him. Later that evening, my mother deleted the brunch photographs from her public page. She did not apologize. She did not admit she had manipulated anyone. Instead, she posted a vague message about how painful it was when private family matters were weaponized by people you trusted. A month earlier, that would have sent relatives rushing to reassure her. This time, almost nobody responded. I did not post again. I did not publish the voicemail. I did not release the photographer thread publicly. The two pieces I had shared had done what I needed them to do. Once everyone had the same starting facts, Linda's greatest weapon stopped working. She had spent years keeping people in separate conversations, giving each of them just enough information to make them carry her version forward. The moment those people started speaking directly to one another, the structure collapsed. For the first time in my life, my mother had not lost an argument because I out-talked her. She lost because everyone finally stopped letting her speak for everyone else. The consequences did not arrive all at once. That was probably the strangest part. After the brunch collapsed and the family group went quiet, there was no dramatic final scene where everyone suddenly understood everything and my mother admitted what she had done. Monday still came. Ethan and I drove back to Raleigh. I returned to work. Bills were paid. Thank you cards needed to be written. For a while, the ordinary shape of married life felt almost surreal after spending 6 weeks waiting for the next family emergency. My father paid the hotel bill. He called me once more to ask whether I would at least cover part of it, and I told him no. Not angrily, just no. By then, he had the authorization in front of him, his signature on the master folio, and the itemized charges. There was nothing left to misunderstand. He and Mom were financially comfortable enough that $17,800 did not destroy them, but it was enough that they had to pull money from savings. Dad later told Amanda that he made Linda reimburse part of it from her personal savings because most of the spa appointments, champagne, and group spending had happened at her encouragement. That detail would have sounded small to anyone outside our family. To me, it was enormous. Dad had spent most of my life handling the consequences of Mom's decisions, so she knew. This time, he did not quietly absorb everything and then ask me to help. He put part of the bill back in front of the person who had helped create it. Mom blamed me anyway. For the first few weeks after the wedding, she told relatives that I had manipulated Dad, humiliated her publicly, and turned Amanda against her. The difference was that people no longer accepted those statements as complete information. Aunt Susan started asking questions. Other relatives did too. Did Rachel actually say that? Became a phrase my mother hated. I heard about it through Amanda, through Susan, and occasionally through people who contacted me directly to verify something instead of assuming Linda's version was mine. I answered factual questions when necessary, but I stopped defending my character. If someone asked whether I had banned my parents from the wedding, I said no. If they asked whether I had promised to pay their incidentals, I said no. If they wanted me to explain why my mother behaved the way she did, I told them they would have to ask her. That last boundary was harder than it sounded. For years, I had been the person who translated Linda for everyone else. I knew what she meant. I knew why she was upset. I knew what apology would calm her down. Once I stopped providing that service, people had to deal with her directly. Craig sent Ethan an apology about 3 weeks after the wedding. It was not elegant. He said he had thought he was being funny at the engagement dinner and had realized afterward that repeating a joke someone had already asked him to stop making was not joking anymore. He admitted he had been an ass. Ethan accepted the apology without turning them into friends. I did the same. Craig was still not retroactively entitled to my wedding, and helping expose Mom's version of events did not erase what started the conflict. That mattered to me. I did not want the ending of the story to turn everyone into heroes and villains based on whether they eventually stood beside me. Amanda changed more quietly. She stopped forwarding Mom's messages. The first time, Linda called her and said, "Tell your sister." Amanda interrupted and said, "If you want Rachel to know something, tell Rachel yourself." Mom hung up on her. Amanda called me afterward, not to relay the message, but because saying no had left her shaking. I reminded her of something she had once made me understand. Surviving our mother differently did not make either of us weak. Then I told her I was proud of her for making her own choice. We did not become instantly inseparable sisters. We still had years of habits to untangle, but for the first time our conversations started belonging to us. Dad tried a different route. About a month after the wedding, he asked if Ethan and I would meet him for lunch without Mom. He looked older than he had at the engagement dinner. He said he had started talking to a counselor on his own because he no longer knew how to keep peace at home without asking someone else to surrender. I appreciated the honesty, but then he said the sentence I had expected eventually. "You and your mother both made mistakes." I put down my fork. Dad immediately started explaining that he was not saying the mistakes were equal, only that everyone had been hurt and somebody needed to begin healing. The old version of me would have taken that opening. I would have admitted something vague so he could carry it home and tell Mom I had taken responsibility, hoping she might finally do the same. Instead, I told him, "I made mistakes. I was too hard on Amanda. I spent too much of my engagement trying to manage Mom's reaction. I almost posted private things I didn't need to post. I can own those. But I'm not going to call Mom choosing to skip my wedding a shared misunderstanding." Dad stared at his plate for a while before nodding. That was enough for me. I did not need him to declare me the winner. By July, the family had begun reorganizing itself in ways I had never expected. Aunt Susan invited different combinations of people to dinner without checking whether Linda approved. Amanda visited relatives without acting as mom's representative. Some family members apologized to me. Others simply stopped bringing up the wedding. A few still believed I had been unnecessarily harsh with Craig, and I learned to live with that too. The biggest change became obvious when Thanksgiving came up in a group conversation months ahead of schedule. For as long as I could remember, Mom had controlled the holiday. Her house, her menu, her seating chart, her rules. This time, Susan casually suggested rotating hosts. Someone immediately said, "Ethan and I should do it because everyone trusts Rachel to organize things." For one dangerous second, I felt the old satisfaction rise in me. I could do it better. I could make the schedules work, prevent arguments, plan the meal, assign rooms, solve every problem before it appeared. I knew exactly how to take the position my mother was losing. Then I realized that would only rebuild the same family with me sitting in her chair. I declined. When Susan asked why, I told her, "I don't want Mom's seat. I wanted her to stop deciding where everyone else had to sit." No one argued. Mom and I were still not speaking regularly when I began telling this story on August 7th, about 12 weeks after the wedding. She had never given me the apology people kept predicting would eventually come. Dad said she was hurt. Amanda said she was angry. Susan said she was embarrassed. Maybe all three were true. I no longer needed to choose the explanation that would make her easiest to forgive. A few days before I started writing everything down, Amanda called and told me Mom had spent the evening alone after another argument with Dad. My first instinct was so old that my hand actually reached for my car keys. For years, that would have been the moment I drove over, brought food, listened to Mom cry, softened whatever consequence had finally reached her, and left believing I had saved the family one more time. I stood in my kitchen holding the keys and asked Amanda whether Mom was safe. "Yes." "Is Dad safe?" "Yes." "Then I'm staying home." Amanda was quiet before saying, "She's alone." I put the keys back on the counter. Being alone with the consequences isn't the same thing as being abandoned. That night, Ethan and I went out for dinner. Nothing extravagant, no family audience, no crisis, waiting on my phone. When the check arrived, I looked at the total before handing over my card, and for some reason I thought about my father's $17,800 hotel bill. For years, my family had treated my reliability like an unlimited account. If I could solve something, I was expected to solve it. If I could afford something, I was expected to pay for it. If I could endure something, I was expected to endure it, so everyone else could remain comfortable. The hardest lesson I learned from my wedding was not how to stop loving my family. It was how to stop confusing love with absorbing their consequences. I had kept my promise. I had paid for the rooms. And for the first time in my life, I had let everyone else pay for their own choices. You should never confuse keeping a promise with accepting unlimited responsibility for other people's choices. A healthy boundary is specific. You decide what you will give, what you will tolerate, and where your responsibility ends. When someone twists your words, save the facts, speak clearly, and resist the urge to fight every accusation. You do not need to rescue people from consequences they created themselves. Protecting your peace is not cruelty, it is maturity. If this story reminded you to value self-respect, wise decisions, and honest relationships, subscribe to the channel for more stories about boundaries, family, and hard-earned lessons.